Hello all, whenever you're watching this video. I'm Connor Keogh, obviously. This is my cat Raja. He's decided to make an appearance. He likes watching over my shoulder while I'm working at the computer. Gives him something to do throughout the day. Um, but this is our second week of Esther, which is going to be quite an interesting one. There's very interesting things within this passage. Um, why don't we start with the word of prayer? Lord, thank you for letting us be able to gather here, Lord. Even though we're not here in person, we can still listen to this whenever we want to. We want to thank you for giving us your word, and thank you for letting us be able to explore it, Lord. And we would ask that every single person who listens to this, let them get something out of it. Let's all bring home something from this scripture, Lord. Please bless our ears with it and our minds, and please bless us as we go along our ways. As we pray in your name. Amen. So, Esther chapter 1. I'm going to read it out for you, and you can follow along in your Bibles if you want. I'm reading from the good old ESV, but feel free to follow along with whatever translation you're most comfortable with. They're all going to line up in the end anyway. There's just a couple different words here and there for the most part. So let's look at Esther chapter 1. The King's Banquets. Now in the days of Xerxes, the Asperos, who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. In those days, when King Xerxes sat on his royal throne in Susa, the capital, in the third year of his reign, he gave a feast for all of his officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media, and the nobles and governors of the provinces were before him, while he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days. And when these days were completed, the king gave for all the people present in Susa, the capital, both great and small, a feast lasting for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There was white cotton curtains and violet hangings fastened with cords of fine linen and purple and silver rods, with marble pillars and also couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of polyphony, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Drinks were served in golden vessels, vessels of all different kinds, and the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king. And drinking was according to this edict. There is no compulsion, for the king has given orders to all the staff of his palace to do as each man desires. Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women in the palace that belonged to King Xerxes. Queen Vashti's refusal. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, and Agatha, Zetar, and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Xerxes, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown, in order to show the people and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. But Queen Vashti refused, and came at the king's command. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. At this, the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. Then the king said to the wise men who knew the times, for this was the king's procedure towards all who were versed in law and judgment. The men next to him bring Karshena, Shetar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meriz, Manasseh, and Mumakan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who saw the king's face, and sat in the kingdom, according to the law, what is to be done to Queen Vashti, because she has not performed the command of the king Xerxes delivered by the eunuchs. Then Mumakan said in the presence of the king and the officials, not only against the king has Queen Vashti done wrong, but also against all the officials, and all of the people who are in the provinces of King Xerxes. For the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their own husbands with contempt, since they will say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. This very day, the noble women of Persia and Media, who have heard of the queen's behavior, will say the same to all of the king's officials, and there will be contempt and wrath in plenty. If it pleases the king, let a royal order to go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be repealed, that Vashti is never again to come before King Xerxes, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. So then the decree was made by the king, as is proclaimed throughout all of his kingdom, for it is vast. All women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. This advice pleased the king and the princes, and the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent letters to all of the royal provinces, to every province in its own script, and to every people in its own language, that every man be master in his own household, and speak according to the language of his people. It's quite an interesting passage. You guys are lucky that I was the one who had to read all of the weird Persian and Median names, but don't worry, you'll get your chance. I'm sure we're going to look at some Hebrew book down the line that's filled to the brim with weird pronunciations. So we're going to look at Esther, week number 2, chapter 1. And I have this titled as Party Time, because at the beginning of the passage we see the 180-day party, followed by the 7 days of feasting. I would get sick after a day, personally. So we're going to take a quick look first at the Persian Empire. And the Persian Empire was huge for its time. It was the biggest empire of the age. It stretched all the way from India to Ethiopia, and I have a map that's going to show the entire kingdom. They're known for their metalwork and their weaving skills. So if you see the picture on the left-hand side there, it's actually a picture from the British Royal Museum of a bull that they found excavated from Persia near Susa, actually the city that's mentioned a couple times as the capital. And we'll talk about that city a little bit later on. But this is the inscription on the bull, and if you can imagine what they did is they took the bull and they just stretched it out flat so that you can see the picture. The actual bull, of course, isn't quite that flat. So that for the day they were quite advanced with how they worked with metal and weaving as well. So the empire lasted from about 530 BC to about 330-ish BC. The issue with the rise and falls of empires is that often you can't set a precise date as to when it starts and when it ends. If we remember the Babylonians, they were conquered by the Persians in 530-ish BC. That's when they finally took control over most of the empire. And of course we know that the Babylonians had a bunch of Jews in exile. So the story of Esther is picking up with the Jews who were in exile, but after Babylon had been conquered. So this was about, the Persian Empire came about 530-ish years before Christ came. Probably closer to 500. And then, of course, it ended in 530-ish, and there's a couple interesting facts about the fall of the Persian Empire that we're going to get into. So the fall came about mostly due to economic collapse. And we're going to get into the reasons why that was. It's pretty fascinating stuff. For any of you moviegoers out there, you might find it quite interesting. But it came because of a big military defeat. And they put a bunch of money towards the invasion, and it didn't go well, which is something that we're going to explore here in a second. So this is a map of the Persian Empire at the time of Ezra, so roughly around the same time as Esther. And if you notice, all the way to the left where it says Thrace, and all the way to the right where it says India, that's the borders essentially of the empire. And then of course if you look down south, we see Jerusalem and the Mediterranean Sea there in Egypt. So it was a massive empire. For its time, this was one of the largest empires ever. And if you notice, way off to the left there, you see this place called Athens. Now, some of you people may know where Athens is. It's in Greece, obviously, and Greece plays a really big part in this story. And we're going to get there pretty soon. And then, of course, if you look right in the middle there, where it says Babylonia, right up and right to where it says that, we see this little place called Susa on the rivers. Now, this isn't Susa like the marching music. This is a different kind of Susa. A pretty interesting one, actually. So the Persians have this really, well, most ancient places had this weird thing where places or people or things were known by multiple names. So Susa or Shushan is the winter capital or the winter stronghold of the Persians. So if we go back, I guess I can't go back to the map, but that's where they would hold their kingdom in the winter, mostly because it was warmest. If you go up north, some it would start to get cold and stuff like that. But if you look at the picture that I have here, this is Susa or Shushan, modern day. And you can see the telephone poles with the electricity going around and stuff like that. And there's some cars and more modern looking buildings off in the distance. But I'm pretty sure that this picture that I found is showing some of what would have been the fortress that King Xerxes would have stayed in. So Susa was a pretty important place. Darius, who was the king before Xerxes, the previous Persian king, who authorized the rebuilding of the temple with Ezra, lived there. So the first Persian king allows the rebuilding of the temple. Xerxes, the king during the reign of Esther, also lives there. And then next, Artaxerxes, and Arta just essentially means son of Xerxes, also lived there, and he allowed the rebuilding of Jerusalem. So there's three major points in Israel's history where foreign kings in the same city are deciding pretty important fates for them, which is pretty interesting. All right. I don't know how to pronounce how some translations pronounce, or how some translations put his first name. It's Arasurus or something like that. And you might have noticed in your translation that when I said Xerxes, it said the other name instead of Xerxes. That's just because depending on a couple different factors, it would, depending on the translator really, what they preferred is what they would put. Both are the same person. They mean the same thing. They're just two different names for the same guy. Now, Xerxes is a pretty interesting fellow. I'm just going to point out first, though, that the Persians do seem to have a theme of double naming things, something that I pointed out earlier, and something that's important when understanding the history of the book. And when I was reading through Esther the first time in the Bible that I was reading from, the ESV, it actually switches sometimes. So the first time I read it, I was like, wait, there's another king? Who is this other guy? But no, Xerxes and however you pronounce the other one, they're the same person. So, has anybody actually seen the movie 300? It's a good movie. I thought it was pretty good anyway. It's kind of violent, but it portrays the story of the Battle of Thermopylae against the Spartans in the mountain pass of Thermopylae, where the 300 Spartans held off the entire Persian army long enough to make them retreat, essentially. Another important part about Xerxes is that, when you're just reading the passage, it kind of seems like Vashti is his only wife. This is not true. Vashti was most likely a part of a harem, and the same as Esther. Esther was also most likely part of a harem. So Xerxes is an interesting fella. This is how he looks in the movie 300. And we're going to kind of connect these events going up pretty soon here too. And of course, like I said, he was the leader of the biggest empire on Earth at the time. He was arguably the most powerful man on Earth at the time. So we're going to get into the narrative a little bit here. A giant party, a failed conquest, and then a new wife. So Xerxes has a party that lasts 180 days. Could you imagine? That would be awful. like I said, like I would have checked out of there after like 1 or 2 days. Like I'm not a big uh event person personally. Like, I'll go to a dinner or whatever, but I'm not big on parties. But he has one that lasts 180 days, and then we have another 7 days of feasting after that. He was quite a partier, I suppose. So he disposes of Vashti in 482 BC. So there's the big party, and then he disposes of one of his wives, most likely. And then he's defeated by the Greeks in 480. So Persia wanted Greece. Greece has a lot of really important natural resources. The people there are pretty hardy. It was the next part of his empire that he wanted. That didn't work out the way he wanted. The Spartans stopped him in Thermopylae, like in the movie 300, and then he tried to attack Athens as well, but it didn't work out either. The Greeks had it against him, and then afterwards he marries Esther in 478 BC. So the events in chapter 1 actually take place 2 years before the events, or sorry, 4 years before chapter 2. And in between the two chapters is this really important historical bit where he is defeated by the Greeks. And this is really important for the Persian Empire because they sunk a lot of money into this conquest. A lot of money, a lot of manpower, and a lot of respect for the king was riding on this. And after they were defeated, it kind of started the snowball effect of the slow downfall of the Persian Empire. So let's look at Vashti a little bit here. Who was she? One of my favorite philosophers, if you can call him that, is Calvin from Calvin and Hobbes. Where Calvin says the best way to honor revolutionaries of the past is for us to become revolutionaries of the future. I really like Calvin and Hobbes. But let's look at who Vashti was. Very little is known of her. We don't really know a lot historically about her. Oh, there's this mention in the Bible, but that's really about it. We know that she was banished, which was kind of surprising because you thought that she would probably have been executed at the time, but she was just banished. And that she was the former wife or concubine of King Xerxes. That's all we really know about her. Like I said, she was likely a concubine or a member of Xerxes' harem. And she was almost the symbol of a revolution. Kinda. That's what Xerxes' court was worried about. They were worried that if Xerxes said, all right, you didn't want to come, that's all right. Don't worry about it. If he had have said that, they were worried that every wife and every household in all of the empire of Persia would start saying to their husbands, oh no, we don't want to do that. They thought that they would, there'd be a rebellion of sorts from the women against the men. And so in order to try and not have this happen, they said, let's just banish Vashti instead. Which brings up some pretty interesting points, knowing that this is what they were worried about. Of course, we know now that, both of the genders are equal. But it's interesting to see the thinking of these ancient people when it comes to these gender politics, I suppose. I'm not really big on the term myself, but it's an interesting development, and we're actually going to talk about this event a little bit later on too. So where is God in this passage? Already this is an ongoing theme I want to keep bringing up in the book of Esther. Because if you remember, one of the things I mentioned last week is that the word God is never actually mentioned in the entire book of Esther. So every time we look at a chapter, I want to take a moment and see where God is in this. And I think this is pretty important, because especially where God is never mentioned explicitly in this entire book, it's important for us to look at where he is. So already we can see, in this beginning passage, we can see God here at work. We could not see this, however, if we didn't know the history, at least for this particular chapter. Um, we can see how God is working through Vashti's fall and her banishment, and also through how the defeat by the Greeks is also going to be affecting the empire later on. So this brings up an interesting question in my third point here, where Vashti took a fall so that Esther could rise up. This brings up an interesting theological question. Now, I assume everybody knows what the word theological means, but theology is the study of God. So when I say there's a theological question or something like that, what I mean to say is there's something that we need to think about here when it comes to God and how he works with us and through us. And that is, can God work through a negative event or a bad thing and make something good come out of it? Vashti and her banishment was not necessarily a positive event, but it was her choice to not go to the king. Essentially, she was choosing to be banished or to have some form of punishment for not obeying the king. But God works through that. He works through that so that Esther can then rise up and take the place and save the Jews from massacre and also help to rebuild Jerusalem. But this is something that we can't see without looking at the history of it. In the moment, Vashti was lucky to get away with her life here. Very lucky to get away with her life here. And I'm sure she probably didn't feel very good. She was probably thinking this is, well, the end of her life. She was a queen and now she's nobody. But God can work through negative events and make positive events come about them. We see this a couple times throughout the Bible, but the real crux of it, the biggest bad event that had good results, was Jesus dying on the cross for us. God working through an inherently negative event to bring about positive results. This happens a couple times throughout, or a bunch of times really, throughout the Bible. But it's important when we're looking at it for ourselves too. When something bad happens in the moment, it's bad. It's not good. Sometimes we question if God is even there to help us with it or not. But thanks to us with this story, we can see that through history, God made a positive event out of it. He made something good come out of the bad. So sometimes we need to have trust that sometimes when bad things happen to us, they don't always end up bad in the future. And I'm sure that there are stories that some people are thinking about right now that, somebody's thinking whatever happened in my childhood or, what even happened last week that I thought was horrible in the moment actually turned out to be something fantastic later on down the road. It doesn't always work out like that. Sometimes bad things happen, and that's a facet of life that we have to deal with. But sometimes God works through those bad things and makes good things come out of it. And sometimes those good things can even be something as simple as like learning a lesson out of it. So for example, when I was a kid, I'm actually going to be bringing this up in my sermon tomorrow. I used to like whittling with knives quite a lot. And my dad was always big on knife safety. He would always tell me, like, make sure you're carving away from yourself. Don't carve towards yourself. Don't swing your blade around. Make sure you're doing short, controlled cuts and all that. And I was the kid who was always like, oh, yeah, Dad, whatever. That's fine. And then I go on, continue with what I was doing. That is until one time when I was whittling and I cut one fingertip off and cut pretty deep into the other finger. And then it was after that negative event, that I realized that, hey, knife safety is actually pretty important. And through that bad thing came about a good thing. It wasn't necessarily a good event, but it was a good mindset change. Sometimes it's hard to see the positive and the negative, but sometimes you need to look for it, and you're greatly rewarded for doing so. So let's keep going. Why does any of this matter anyway, when we're looking at the book of Esther? This first chapter seems to be a lot of preamble, a lot of setup, I guess. Calvin here says, if you care, you just get disappointed all the time. If you don't care, nothing matters, so you're never upset. I don't know if there's a whole lot of truth to that, but it's kind of funny nonetheless. One of the most important parts of this chapter, especially, is context, context, context. You're probably going to hear me rambling about this quite a lot when it comes to Bible studies, in that we need the full context to be able to understand these scriptures. So, for example, like the previous one that I mentioned, it's important that we realize the history of the book so that we can understand the book on a deeper level. And through that, understand God on a deeper level, which is really what we're aiming for here. In order to understand Esther's story, we need to know about the backdrop, even if it isn't necessarily the most interesting thing in the world. I know when I brought up that map, some of you probably groaned and went, oh, it's like grade school all over again. Yes and no. It's important to know where and when things happened. It makes the rest of the book better. It makes it more clear. And like I said, it helps us to be able to understand where God is in it, and in turn help us to get to know him better. So even though we've barely read a thing yet, we can already see God's hand at work. And this will become something of a theme in this book. I'm going to try and point out every time God is alluded to within this book. Especially where, like I said, he's never mentioned explicitly. It's all the more important to figure out where he is throughout the book. So, that's my presentation on Esther chapter 1. I did have one question from last week that I thought I'd explore a little bit. This one came from Marie, actually. And if any of you have any questions, feel free to ask me, and I'll put them up for next week like I did with this one. I don't have to say your name if you don't want me to. But Marie asked, if the Hebrew language has no vowels, how do we translate it to English or even speak it? So last week I had mentioned that when we were looking at the word Yahweh, which is the Hebrew word for God, which is to us would be spelled YHWH. Y, of course, isn't a vowel in this case. How do we even know how to pronounce it? There's no vowels. Hebrew's a weird language. I'm not very good with languages personally. I passed Greek, and I'm very happy I passed Greek because I never have to take it again. But Hebrew works on a system where you read it from bottom right, I believe, to top left. That or top right to bottom left. I can't remember. I know it's backwards to what we read it anyway. But the alphabet is arranged in such a way that there's no vowels. Kind of like Esther, where God is never explicitly said, but he's always implicitly there. The same way with Hebrew is that there's no explicit vowels, but there's always implied vowels. So for example, if I put this up, this is a sentence in English without any vowels. And if I gave you guys a few minutes, I'm sure that you'd be able to work it out. It says Hebrew is the only ancient language that has been revived and reestablished for modern use. You have to think about it a little bit to get through, but if you were reading like that all day, every day, you get used to it and you pick it up pretty fast. I know people who, when they're taking notes for class, will write shorthand, and they'll write like this. They'll write English without any vowels so that they can write faster and take more notes. So I hope that explains the question a little bit anyway. When we're translating it to English, it's the same as translating any other language. If we know that the Hebrew word for God is Yahweh, even though it doesn't have any vowels, we still know that it means God, so that we can put it into the Bible as God or Lord or whatever the context demands it. So again, if you guys have any questions, just let me know. I'm more than happy to answer them. And like I said, if I don't know the answer off the top of my head, I will make sure to research a little bit and get back to you guys. I'm learning through all of this with you, and I'm enjoying it quite a lot, actually. When I realized that the movie 300 takes place in between Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 of Esther, I thought it was quite fascinating, actually. But yeah, God bless, and we'll see you next week.